Researchers have found this tiny neurotransmitter is what your brain uses to give you motivation. But not only is it the reason why some of us are motivated to achieve our potential, it's also the same reason why many of us can't stop scrolling our phones. And its name is dopamine. And whilst many people think that dopamine is all about pleasure, it's actually our motivational fuel. So then how come some people can use dopamine to become motivated when most of us feel stuck? Well, researchers have found we have common habits that make it physically impossible to become motivated. On the bright side, however, they've also found a 4-part formula for instantly unlocking our motivation. So much to the point where we can end procrastination, fall in love with hard work, and stay motivated forever. Before learning these things, I thought I was naturally unmotivated. Today, they've changed my life. So what's this formula? Well, to understand how it works, we first need to understand the steps of the motivation process. See, initially we all start at a baseline level of dopamine. Then as our brains recognize something that will give us a reward, it begins to release dopamine above our baseline. This gives you that initial feeling of anticipation and excitement, like when you see good food. This step is usually what we think of when we think of motivation, and it's also the starting point of how to find our motivation. Then without doing anything, our dopamine actually drops below baseline, which gives us a feeling of discomfort and craving. This feeling of craving is what actually gives us the motivation to take action and get rid of that discomfort. But as we'll soon see, it's also one of the main reasons why we struggle to find motivation. Then as we begin to take action, our dopamine starts to increase and our discomfort starts to fade. And when we complete the action, we get a big spike in dopamine, that feeling of pleasure that makes us feel good and tells us to do it again. The thing is, this motivation process is exactly the same regardless of whether it's eating a piece of chocolate or going to the gym. So the first question is, how do we start this motivation process for the things we actually want to do? Well, here's part 1 of the formula. Remember, the first step in the motivation process is that our brains need to recognize opportunities for reward, but it can't do that unless it knows what opportunities to look out for. The thing is, it's up to us to program these opportunities into our brains. Think of your brain as the driver and you as the car. It can take you anywhere you want to go, all it needs is direction. And this direction actually comes from our goals. Our goals define what our brains reward. But this is where we make our first mistake. See, when most of us set goals, we just tell ourselves we want to be rich and fit. But to our brains, these aren't recognizable opportunities. Instead, there's a specific way to set goals to work with our brain's motivation system. And this improves our outcomes 90% of the time. See, a key part of our motivation system that kicks us into action is the basal ganglia, which is in charge of motor control and initiating action. The key word here is action. Remember the third step in the motivation process? Actions are what our brains reward and are what we need to define. In other words, you can think of actions as the road our brains motivate us to follow to reach our goals. But the thing is, studies show there are 3 key criteria we need when we set actions. The first is that your actions must be concrete. Imagine if someone told you that to lose weight you need to work out. Well, you'd have 100 questions on what workout to do. You'd be lost. But instead, if someone told you to go to the park at 7 AM and walk for 30 minutes, you know exactly what to do. Your actions need to be defined to the point where anyone can take it as a set of instructions and go and do it. Secondly, there needs to be a clear link between the action and reward, because our brains only motivate actions which come with a reward. And third, your actions need to be time-bound. This is because a key part of the motivation system relies on deadlines. Knowing these 3 things, we can start to see that the best way to plan our goals is in reverse. Which means we start by defining our end target, what we want to achieve and by when, and then work backwards to map out all the milestones down to a weekly time frame, which we can then use to identify the daily actions that will meet those weekly milestones. By doing this, it becomes 100% clear to your brain that these actions will lead to your goals, which is the start to you finding your motivation and falling in love with hard work. But this is where many of us hit a roadblock. Even if we set the perfect plan, we still struggle to find motivation and we procrastinate. Why? Well, it turns out to get motivated, we first need to remove the things that prevent motivation. This brings us to part 2 of the formula. Part 2 has to do with how much dopamine we have in our system. See, in some cases, we actually make it physically impossible to become motivated. Remember how dopamine goes up when we do something rewarding? Well, immediately after that, we get a crash. This is because some dopamine gets used up to create that high, and it takes some time to regenerate. Now, normally these crashes aren't significant, but they can be if what we do is highly pleasurable and easy to access. This is because the more pleasurable the activity, the higher the high and the more dopamine that gets used up. And the easier it is to access, the easier it is to keep consuming without allowing our dopamine time to regenerate. And over time, this leads to a dopamine deficient state. This creates 2 big problems. The first and most obvious is that we have less dopamine. This means we end up reducing our ability to enjoy things like pursuing our goals, meaning we lose our ability to become motivated. And secondly, this makes us develop a strong craving for the things that drain our dopamine, so much so that we lose interest in other things like pursuing our goals. So why is this important? Well, because research shows the things that spike our dopamine are the things we use constantly. Things like TV, social media, video games, and all the other things we can't stop ourselves from doing. These things give us a good time, but we don't realize they are single-handedly depleting our dopamine, making us think we're naturally unmotivated and lazy. So what can we do? Well, we need to take a break from these things so that our dopamine can recharge back to baseline. However, the amount of time we need depends on how much we've been binging.
What we find in clinical care is that on average, it takes about 4 weeks after we've stopped using our drug of choice, whether it's TikTok or chocolate, or in my case, romance novels.
That was Dr. Anna Lembke, known for her book Dopamine Nation and for treating many patients who suffer from a lack of motivation. But what she hasn't said is that it can also take less than 4 weeks to recover. So the trick to know when your dopamine is back to normal is when you no longer have compulsive cravings and you can start to enjoy simpler things, meaning you can start to become motivated. In this way, you can think of dopamine as the power for your car. Even if you know where you want to go, you won't have the motivation to get there unless you have enough. And so you need to give it time to recharge. That's why 4 years ago, when I gave up gaming, it was the start of me actually enjoying productive things and achieving my goals. Trust me when I say taking a break can change your life. So now that we've allowed ourselves to become motivated, how do we tap into instant motivation? Well, this leads us to part 3 of the formula. See, a core part of our motivation system is the amygdala, and the amygdala is responsible for detecting threats and giving us feelings of fear to avoid pain. And if you didn't know, humans have a negativity bias. We are more likely to take action to avoid pain rather than to feel pleasure. It's why we don't give up junk food until we have health issues, why we don't start our homework till the night before, or why we don't start working out until we're single. It's when we sense a threat that the amygdala raises our blood pressure and causes a release of dopamine, kicking us into action. In this way, you can think of threats as the jump starter to your car. If you're low on motivation, then the presence of a threat will give you the energy to get going. What this also means, however, is we're unlikely to take action unless we feel like we need to. This is one of the reasons why so many billionaires are college dropouts. They had no choice but to succeed. So how do we tap into this motivation? Well, studies show we can do this by feeling the threat of failure.
Where there's a near doubling in the likelihood that people will reach goals of any kind when they're constantly thinking about how bad it's going to be if they fail.
It was only when I saw that gaming was stopping me from becoming a straight-A student that I found the motivation to quit. So have a think about the threats to your goals that will get you moving. Now, whilst it's useful to get motivated, it won't last long unless we know how to stay motivated. Because even if we start taking action, we all eventually get tempted to give up. So how do we keep our motivation? Well, this leads us to the most important part of the formula. See, surprisingly, there's a way to guarantee you stay motivated forever, and it all comes back to dopamine. Remember that final step in the motivation process where we get that hit of dopamine when we achieve the recognized action? Well, if our goals are set properly, then our brains will actually reward us with dopamine for progressing our goals, giving us the motivation and craving to do it again and again and again. It becomes this snowball of momentum. But here's the problem. It can take months or years before we make any kind of progress. And because our brains have a preference for short-term rewards, it's hard to get the motivation to keep going. But this is where we make our mistake. We focus on comparing where we are to where we want to be. But the problem with that is you only feel motivated when you achieve your result, when you need the motivation now. So a better approach suggested by best-selling success author James Clear is to track your level of effort instead of your results. He calls this habit tracking. By tracking whether you put in the work, your level of effort becomes your measure of progress and what your brain rewards with dopamine. In other words, you teach your brain to fall in love with hard work. So you can think of measuring your effort as adding more fuel to your car. Each time you do it, you get more motivation to keep going. For me, I track how many hours I spend learning and working each day, and this motivates me to stay productive. So what's the formula for motivation? Well, to start the motivation process, we need to reverse plan our goals. But the process can only start if we let our dopamine recharge. Then to kick ourselves into action, we need to think about threats, and then to stay motivated, we need to measure our effort. Now, whilst it's important we feel excited about our goals, there's always going to be days where we just don't feel like doing anything. This is where turning our actions into daily habits comes in, but habits are incredibly hard to form. So I made a video explaining the science of habit change and how you can use it to stay consistent with your fitness goals right here. Till then, you only live this life once, make the most of it.